Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Trevor Crow with the law firm Doida Crow Legal. And quick background: we represent business owners, buyers, investors, and mainly work in M&A transactions, lower middle market. We also do securities work and general corporate transactions. And so that's really us. But today we have a special webinar, a little different. I'm joined by John Rapacki of GWS Consulting, which is a Denver-based M&A advisory and consulting firm. John has over 20 years of experience in finance and deal work, and he typically works with business owners on the front end of an M&A transaction, helping the owners understand the market for the business, help prepare the company for sale, identify and approach potential buyers, and then kind of create that competitive tension that you need to get the best offers. Then through the whole process of evaluating the offers and negotiating the business terms of the transaction. So, what I really appreciate about John is he works across a broad set of industries, and so that helps him, I think, with all the transactions he does, and with companies at different stages. So that brings a real practical, real world sort of perspective to these conversations. And so, John, thanks a lot for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Great. All right. Well, today's we're gonna shoot for 30 to 45 minutes on this topic, which is probably gonna leave us with a little bit to be desired at the end, but we'll get through as much as we can and hopefully provide some value here for everybody. As a reminder, today's topic is about evaluating buyers, and it's beyond just the top line purchase price. And I think that distinction really matters because different buyers approach acquisitions very differently. And a strategic buyer, private equity buyer, or sort of a search fund, ETA type buyer may all submit offers that look similar in the top line price, but the economics and risk allocation and diligence process, financing certainty, a number of different things could be very different. And so we're going to be talking about that today. And just a reminder, we really are talking in general terms. Every deal is going to be different. So we're not, at the end of the day, we're not saying one buyer type is better than another as a general, broad brush. But the goal is really to just provide a practical framework for how sellers evaluate or should evaluate buyers, beyond just the purchase price. So we'll get started here. If you have questions along the way, all the participants who are joining, please use the chat or the Q&A function to submit it. Just as soon as a question comes to your mind, put it in there. We're not gonna we're just gonna run through this, and as questions pop up, we'll try to address them then. So please go ahead and do that. And then before I jump into the questions to John, I am going to provide just a little bit of background on defined terms here, so that we don't have to repeat this in the beginning. But really, when we're talking about a strategic buyer, we're talking about usually an established operating company that either already does what the seller does or does something adjacent to it. And they either want to expand into a market, or they may be looking for new customers. It could be geographic expansion. It could be they want to add additional services or products, or sometimes it's really, more of I need more employees to create more capacity for the business. So that's what we're talking about when we say strategic buyer. A private equity buyer or a PE buyer is really a financial buyer, and that usually it's a fund that invests in companies, number of portfolio companies, with the goal of increasing the value of those companies and then selling them again. So usually they have a timeline for their fund, so that's kind of a 4 to 7 year hold period. And PE firms might be looking for a company either as a platform company, something to be the platform, and then or it could be they already have a platform company and they're adding on, or tuck in, it might be called, to an existing portfolio platform company. So that's what we're talking about when we say PE buyer. And then we have kind of ETA and search fund buyers. And ETA means entrepreneurship through acquisition. I would say that usually those are individual or small teams looking to acquire and operate a business. A search fund is similar, except for, at least how I use these terms. Search funds are usually looking for a larger business because they have some committed capital. And so they may be for looking for somewhat of a larger target than an ETA buyer. So whereas the ETA buyer might be more focused on a 5 million and under, SBA sized acquisition. So anyway, that's the defined terms. That's what we'll be using, and we'll jump right in here. So John,
All right.
first question for you.
Yeah.
What would you say is the biggest differences in, when we're talking about deal terms here, between what you might see from a PE buyer versus a strategic buyer versus a search fund buyer, that are submitting, looking to buy a business?
Your biggest differences as far as your deal terms are going to be with the PE buyer, again, speaking kind of in that generality, um, they like established management teams and teams that are going to stick around. So that's usually incentivized differently. So it's usually incentivized by rolled equity. There could be earnout structure, but their goal is to keep whoever the original owner is intact, the management team intact, running the business, running the day-to-day, especially if it's a platform business. That's going to be often critical. There's a lot of PEs out there that won't even look at an opportunity if the management team wants to, make a full exit. So that's going to be probably the biggest one. You can still see some equity come into play in a strategic scenario, but it's not going to be as common if, especially if the goal an exit, a full exit after a transition period. Strategic buyers often, are reputationally are going to be more favorable in their terms. Kind of the general assumption is the way they're going to value your business, the multiples they're going to use are going to be a little bit more aggressive. You're going to see a little bit more cash, and then maybe might be structured more cash and some seller's note and less on any kind of equity or earn-out type structure. Whereas in a search fund, ETA will be similar to that because again, they're planning on running the business. So they're looking for a business in which the original owners or the management team are going to exit the business. So they're going to come in with more of a cash, seller's note type thing and not an equity option.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. I think I didn't really mention that on the search fund definition or ETA buyer definition. It's really they're looking to buy and operate the business themselves. So that's similar to a strategic, and then where the PE is really looking for the team to stay in place. That makes sense.
Yep.
Oh, okay. So, when a seller gets multiple offers, if you have a deal that you're marketing and, inevitably they get multiple offers for the business, how are you advising your sellers on where the highest price is not the best offer? I mean, have you been in a situation where you've seen, hey, we've gotten four LOIs, but the highest price one is maybe not the best offer, and talk about that a little
Sure.
bit.
Yeah. So, I mean, ultimately, before you even start the process, you need to figure out and have a conversation with your advisor, with your attorney, and say, like, this is what's important to me outside of, getting your $100 million you hope that everybody wants to get, right? So what are the important things that you hope to walk away from this with? What are the things that matter as far as keeping the business intact? What matters as far as your employees, things like that, and identifying that up front so that you can approach that during the process because that also will likely inform, your strategy. It's not super common, or it can happen, but you're typically going to head towards the strategic route or the PE route or, or the search funder type route explicitly, not typically blanket it to just about anyone, depending on what your goals are. So if the goal is to de-risk, for instance, but you're on, you're still young enough in your career, you're in your late 40s, early 50s, have no interest in fully retiring, finding a good partnership in which you can still stay and work and do those things might be more important, just as important as the value of the business. And that could go either way. That could be a PE group or a larger strategic that where you just kind of take a lesser of a role within the group. But those are things you'll want to negotiate. What does that employment contract look like? What are you going to be doing for them? Are you going to like working for them? It's also important to think about you're not going to be the boss anymore. That's a hard pill for a lot of people to swallow who've been an entrepreneur for however long. So things like that. A lot of other things I see people are like who are really worried about, what happens to their employees. Some people want, some people really matters to keep like the business name or their legacy intact. That certainly presents a challenge depending on your business, if you especially if you're on the smaller side, because any larger buyer is going to, from a strategic standpoint, is going to want to roll you under their umbrella unless there's a lot of customer loyalty to your brand. It doesn't necessarily benefit them to keep it separate. So, I mean, those are all conversations that you need to have, like I said, with your advisor, with your attorneys, and all of that.
So you'll have a conversation with the seller early, and then usually that kind of leads to what type of buyer you might be approaching at that point. Is that kind of it sounds like you
Yeah.
said usually that it runs down, all right, well maybe we'll be looking at these type buyers versus these type buyers if these are your goals in this typical situation.
Yeah, the conversation should include like what's the motivation for pursuing a sale? If it's,
Hmm.
is it just to capitalize on the market? Is there personal reasons, medical reasons? Is it burnout? Is it like, are you just super entrepreneurial and like, okay, I'm done doing this thing. I want to do something else, like whatever it is. Or if it's just a de-risk situation and want to, you feel like you've grown it to the level you can grow it to, and you want to partner up with somebody who can help you grow it more. Like, what are the motivations? Yeah, based off of that, what's important after the transaction closes and what's important to get out of it outside of just some extra money in your bank account.
Right, right. So how does the seller choose, or how should they choose which LOI to accept? I mean, how does that conversation go when you have those multiple LOIs and you're saying, all right, let's think through this and pick how we pick one. Um, you know, how do you help them choose?
Well, oftentimes, as much as it would be nice if it was always 100% straightforward, you're going to get X amount of dollars in cash,
Yeah.
Y amount in a seller's note, and that's that. That would certainly simplify it and make it easy. Very rarely does it happen that simply nowadays, I'm sure you can attest to. So first, it's understanding the true value of the offer from just a pure monetary sense. So from a dollars and cents standpoint, like this is making sure that the seller, the business owner, knows exactly what they're getting from a dollars and cents standpoint at close. And if there are certain other things from a seller's note, earnouts, equity, all those things, and understanding what that value is worth and when you're gonna get it and what the risks are. I mean, the only thing that has zero risk on it is the cash you get at closing, right? Anything beyond
Hmm.
that, seller's notes, earnouts, any other terms, like that's all risk related. So understanding what the risks are and what you're going to get. So really making sure you understand the monetization standpoint, and then in addition to that, the separate part, but equally as important, are those other terms that we talked about. Like, this buyer over here might be giving you a little bit more upfront, but, you know, 50% of your staff's gonna be let go because it's redundant for them and they don't need all that staff or whatever. Or they want you to fully exit and you expressed an interest in working. So that means you're gonna have to go find a job. So that kind of thing.
Hmm. Got it. Yeah, and well, along those same lines, what are the biggest mistakes that you've seen business owners make when they're looking at potential buyers, and making that decision? You know, what sort of mistakes have you seen?
So I think a lot of mistakes honestly aren't really getting into the negotiation process earlier, especially, with the LOI. I mean, you'll appreciate this. This was not,
Hmm.
so for everybody's benefit, this was not, motivated by Trevor to say, but it is true. You should get your lawyer involved at the LOI stage, because I think people tend to think LOIs are non-binding, which is true. So they think it doesn't matter as long as the deal terms are outlined at a high level, we'll figure out the rest. And it just creates so much more headache, creates expenses, creates just, I think it pushes people to do things that maybe they wouldn't have normally done instead of being more patient with finding a buyer. Because there is that mindset of I'm already so far in, we're supposed to close in 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever. We've already done all the diligence, we've done all this, but we can't agree on these terms. And so, are you going to be more likely just to give in? Whereas in the beginning, if you would have laid that out, you would have said, no, move on to the next and let's negotiate with somebody else. So I think not hashing out all of the deal terms that matter within the earlier stage of the negotiation process is a huge mistake that I see a lot of people make.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say that I would second that. I mean, I think that it's usually some small thing that
Yeah.
was a deal breaker, a known deal breaker in the beginning, but wasn't addressed in the LOI, which becomes an issue. And so, that's kind of my mantra usually to sellers and buyers, honestly, is that, make sure you have all the deal breakers in the LOI, because those are the things
Yeah.
that could be indemnification, it could be holdbacks, it could be escrow, it could be transition services. There could be a million different things that it could be, and it's really talking through those and understanding what those are. So yeah, I agree, and I can attest to that for sure, seeing it on our side. So let's talk about strategic buyers for a second, and we'll
Sure.
kind of jump into each one of these as a category.
Sure.
What usually motivates a strategic buyer to acquire a business? What are they looking for, and why would a strategic buyer come, approach a seller?
Usually I mean, they're the kind of the bigger buckets. I mean, you touched on some of them. It's expanding from a geographical standpoint, expanding from a product standpoint. Maybe they're an accounting firm that's been doing audits and tax and they want to get into Q of E's and valuations or something like that. So they'll acquire a Q of E and valuations firm to add that established product line because while they have the staff to do the work, they haven't been doing the work or they don't know how to break into the market or whatever that might be. So they might want to add a new product, a new service. They might want to, if their business is geographically dependent, skilled trades, for instance, and they have a good foothold on one market and they want to broaden into a new market or just get a bigger foothold on that market, is another reason. Another reason that doesn't necessarily always get mentioned is vertical integration or just cost savings. So if you're a manufacturing company and you're using one of the things you do is you have this product you manufacture is spray powder coating on it. But you outsource that and it's cost a lot of money for it. You can buy a powder coating firm that will do it for you and you're paying yourself to do it now and reducing your costs and things like that. So that's another area where it makes a lot of sense for people to look at an acquisition to streamline the process. It might make it faster, cheaper. There'll be savings, there's revenue growth, and really the fastest way to growth. I mean, it's tried and true. You don't have to read all the textbooks to know is through acquisition. So if you can acquire and you want to grow and you just want to get bigger, the fastest way to do that is to acquire.
Right, right. Great. Hey, we did get one question here, so I'm going to ask you this question then. So it says this came in the Q&A. It says, how does the process work when selling to PE and the owner stays on? Is negotiating the employment agreement part of the sale agreement or separate? And how does the timing work in a best case scenario?
Yeah, so assuming you're going to be part of a platform company, so there's two differences, I think. So for your platform, which means you're big enough, so there's Trevor touched on platform versus tuck-in. So platform just means you're a little bit bigger. They don't have, say you, I don't know, stick with the accounting firm. Say you're a really big accounting firm. You do 50 million a year in revenue or something like that. And they don't have a firm that does that. You're going to be the platform. You're going to be the first one they buy. Then they're going to go out and buy all the mom and pops, the smaller firms that do a couple million here and there and roll them up to tend to grow and gain that market share. If you're a platform, they absolutely are going to want you to stay. So part of the negotiation um, of the deal will include the equity and will include those terms of your staying a lot earlier on rather than later. I've seen it done both ways in terms of your employment agreement being negotiated separately. Um, and part of it, but at a PE group, especially if you're the platform, they're going to want it to be part of it because that, like I said, they want their established management team. So they're going to have some caveat on there that like they could have a vesting period for your equity that you have to stay, or it's all your equity, but you're committing to stay for a certain period of time or whatever, negotiating your salary and your duties and your responsibilities if you're going to run the company as CEO, if you were more of a sales type person and you're going to go back to that role and they're going to have somebody else be CEO or whatever, like you'll figure all that out earlier and usually put that as part of the purchase and sale agreement. Where it gets a little bit different is and can be handled kind of more parallel with it, rather than part of it is if you're more of a tuck-in or maybe even on the strategic side, like everybody's going to always want you to stay on and do some transition period. Nobody wants you just to run out the door. But if the goal is to have you stay on longer term and you want to stay on longer term, um, when you're selling to a PE, if you're the tuck-in, chances are they're not going to need you to run your company uh, as a leader or CEO. So you're going to want to negotiate that earlier on. Like, yeah, I want to stay, I want to work, I'm getting equity. So what does my role look like? So again, you'll want to do that earlier on, as part of it. If you're a tuck in and you're okay with taking a step back, then you can just have, usually the transition part of it is where you'll negotiate a separate, you know, contractor type relationship, parallel to it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll add some color from my side, from the legal side. I would say, the certainly it depends a little bit on the size of the seller and who the owners are, right? If it's a two-person owners and they're both staying on and they both need to approve the transaction, then it usually gets negotiated a lot earlier in the process because that's a big piece of the deal, So this is an LOI term, kind of when we talked about some of the pitfalls of just signing an LOI without having the major terms in there. It's, you want to get the major terms of that employment agreement and ongoing employment in the LOI. But I've also had deals where, the company's more widely held and and maybe the CEO owns a little bit of the company, but doesn't really control the sale. And that's who they want to stay on. And so oftentimes that CEO has to have a separate representation, other than the company's counsel, and they're negotiating that a little bit separately. But from a timing standpoint, I think the employment agreement historically, at least when I've been on sell side in a PE deal, it comes late in the process, and I hate that. And so I'm always hounding the buy side attorneys to get us a draft employment agreement as soon as possible because it's really frustrating when all the deal documents are basically done except for this employment agreement, and you get that 3 days before closing, and now you're trying to negotiate and get that done. And so I would say that's a frustrating thing. So from a timing standpoint, getting it done early is really an important thing, and getting the terms early in the LOI is important. So,
Yeah, I
um,
agree. I think subconsciously it gets pushed to the end all the time because it's like, well, let's make sure we hit on all these big things that matter for the, purchase and sale agreements and
mhm,
diligence and all that kind of stuff. And like, oh, that's a minor detail. So, but again, that kind of goes back to the beginning comments about like what's important to you. So if that's important to you, then make it a point when you're going through your sale to talk about it earlier and make it a point to make sure that they know that this is important to you and that you're not going to keep going on the process unless you have that and then that'll motivate them to get something in front of you.
right. Yeah, good point. Hey, we have one more question here that we're going to go on. This is great. If you guys have questions, I mean, we want to answer your questions. So
Yeah,
rather
absolutely.
than me giving the questions, but so we'll answer this one too. And this is a good one for you, John. It says, when would you recommend a seller to get a sell side Q of E done? Is there a threshold of adjusted EBITDA, SDE, where you recommend it? For example, over 500,000 or something like that, or when would you recommend sell side Q of E?
I there's differing philosophies on this. You'll talk to some other M&A firms, advisory firms that will not even take you on as a client unless you do one. I don't personally prescribe by that because chances are if you do one with your sell side advisor, whoever buys you is going to make you do another one. Granted, because they're going to do it with the firm that, especially if it's a PE side, because they'll have a short list of firms that they just partner with that they'll approve or whatever. Um, so I think, but what I do think it's important to do is you can do, there's other alternatives. You can do, independent valuations or independent, like, accounting reviews and things like that. I think it's less about the dollar amount of SDE and more about also the complexities of it and what is buried in there and where it's buried. If it, I've had clients that have had over $1 million in SDE and I'm not a huge personal fan of SDE as a term. Adjustments I like better. I don't know, it's just semantics, but where they personally spent money that, to the tune of over a million, $1 million a year plus, um, but it was super straightforward. It was straight draws. So it didn't really matter. You could literally see the transaction that was a check that they cut out of the business to themselves in a perfectly round number of 100,000 at a time or 200,000 at a time or something like that. So the fact that it was $1 million isn't what triggered the Q of E. So the Q of E we just did once we were in diligence. However, I've had some where it is much smaller, a couple hundred grand, but when you're factoring in multiples, 200 grand times five, there's $1 million for you. But it's buried in your credit card statements. It's buried in this transaction. It's, if it's buried in, some that are justifiably good business expenses, but you also piggybacked on it and bought something for yourself or whatever. Like if it gets really complex, then you're going to want to do it a little bit earlier to kind of prove that out. Then it is a little bit more justifiable to do a Q of E, a sell side Q of E before you go to market, or at least a valuation. And valuation firms, if you say this is what I'm after, like because the valuation firm does take into account adjustments and add backs. If you say I want you to validate the add backs, for when we go to market, it's sometimes it's a cheaper option. Whereas a good Q of E, depending on how, I mean, the firm, it can be any, and the size and complexity of your business, you're looking at usually a minimum of 25-ish grand, upwards of 60, 70, 80, 100. I've seen, a really big bill but a valuation, 10 grand-ish, depending on, again, complexities and all the transactions and those kinds of things. And they can ultimately hope to accomplish the same thing in the beginning because the unfortunate part of that is if you do one in the beginning, you're going to have to probably do another one during diligence as well.
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a good point on not necessarily dollar size being the trigger. It's really complexity,
Yep.
and how hard it is to show that show that in your financials. So, great. All right, well, back to strategic buyers, and one more
Yeah.
question on them. One thing that I'm concerned about if I'm representing a seller and they're looking at a strategic buyer that competes with them, it's a competitor that's doing the same thing as them, is confidential information and due diligence, and are we giving away the keys to the castle here, and then they don't close, and now there's a big issue. Of course, we have confidentialities and an NDA in place, but those are I always say are harder to enforce and prove. So how do you think about that? How do you advise clients about due diligence and confidentiality when you're dealing with, a competitor buyer?
Yeah, I think, well, you made this anecdote the other day, and it was 100% true. Is like even if they're not using it intentionally to harm you or compete with you, you cannot remove that information from their brain. They've seen it. So,
Hmm.
starting with the things that they need to start with evaluating their business. If they're a competitor, they obviously know of you. They already know of the services you offer. So sharing financials, that's not necessarily going to give them some huge competitive edge. Of course, it's proprietary, but seeing how much money you make isn't necessarily going to give them that edge. It's really the things like, if you have a different process, if you have, a secret sauce kind of a thing, if you have your customer lists, if there's some way you structure your contracts, in certain businesses where it's really challenging to find, skilled labor or something like that. You're, sharing all of your employees and how much they're making. That's going to be something that often gets overlooked. That's all stuff you're going to have to share eventually. But there's ways around that in the beginning. So customers, usually in the beginning, you can get away with like, look, I'll give you a customer breakdown that's anonymized, and it just really they just want to see customer concentration. They want to make sure that you're not getting all your money from two customers or three customers or something like
Mhm.
that. So you can say, customer A does, 1 million with me, and that equates to 5% of my business, and so on, and just call it customer A, B, C, D, and that's sufficient. And then you can you're going to have to then work again. I would work with your advisor on this and say, okay, and your attorney, and you get to a certain point where we're far enough along in the purchase and sale agreement process. We feel good about it. There's no major sticking points at this point. Now we can share this. We're just waiting for some smaller things to wrap up that aren't likely to be deal killers. There's all kinds of things that can come up all the way until the end, but you're just going to have to kind of gauge your comfort level as to when and see, I guess, how hard they're pushing, and just have that good communication with them. Like, hey, I'm going to share this information with you, but I want to feel comfortable that you know, we've gotten past all the major stuff and we're on the right track and those kinds of things.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes sense. Kind of staging out the diligence
Yeah.
to make sure that you're not giving away everything right away, and then
Yeah. There's
getting more certainty of close there
with
seems.
with with all of it, there's general, so like when I set up a data room for buyers of my prospective clients, it's pretty easy to set up like different groups and subgroups of folders that you can kind of move people along in the stage where you can start with that initial information, which is almost, pretty much always the financials. That's just like kind
Hmm.
of the basic start for everything. And then you can kind of get into some more stuff operationally and then kind of the next step. And then if
Hmm.
there's anything proprietary, that's the very last thing.
Yeah, got it. Great. All right. How about this situation? You have a seller who's getting approached by a PE firm. The deal is kind of we're they're getting some uh, cash at closing. You're getting, and then they want to roll over equity and obviously keep the management team in place and have an employment agreement with this seller. Um, what questions are you saying that the seller would you advise that seller to ask that PE firm, when they're considering them as the buyer?
Oh, that's a great question. So I would say, trying to understand their general strategy and their vision for this process, or like, not the sales process itself, but beyond closing, beyond acquiring you, like what is the goal? What is the strategy? And get into a little bit of the detail. They're not going to maybe share everything because that might be their secret sauce, so to speak. But they can tell you, like, the vision is to have you be the platform. We want to acquire and grow to this point before we approach and sell a market or things like that. And understanding what their goals, and it doesn't mean it won't change because you're going to be, working with these people from 4 to 7 years or anywhere in there, but it could be longer even. And so depending on markets, depending on what happens, things shift. But generally speaking, what's the plan, at least going into it, I think is really important to understand to make sure you want to be a part of that strategy. And to make sure you think it's sound, but really just to see if you want to be a part of it. If it's, they're more than likely it's going to involve some additional acquisitions and growth. But that can still look a lot of different ways. And if you're still steering the ship, it can mean a lot of different things for how you're having to deal with that and what you're going to be actually doing on the day to day and things like that. The other thing I think people don't really do enough of is really doing their own due diligence on that PE firm to make sure that
Hmm.
they're going to be good to work with. So many times I've seen, I mean, when PE firms started being successful, like anything else, then the market gets flooded, and there's so many middle market PE firms now. And now because there's so many, they're dipping lower. You'll see lower middle market, and I even see small business PE firms now. So because there are so many, there are good ones and there are bad ones, just like anything else. And so just because they have the money does not mean they're a good firm and you're going to enjoy the experience of working with them. I mean, the generic explanation of a lot of PEs is armchair quarterback. Like a lot of people who are investment professionals with fancy educations that have never run a company in their life. And so they don't really know what it takes to run a company, and what you're really doing on the day to day. And that can make a really challenging experience when they're trying to tell you what to do.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's great. I think that's, so it sounds like, finding out what their investment, thesis is and how they plan to operate the business post closing, kind of what is their exit timeline, when is their fund up, and then, also how really doing kind of that reverse due diligence on how do they work with companies, their portfolio companies, and are they going
Yeah.
to be people you're going to want to work with?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, great. Let's switch to ETA, and we're running out of time here, but we'll try to hit a couple more questions. And if anybody has any other questions, please put in the queue of A. But if you're selling to an ETA or search fund type entrepreneur buyer, what are the risks of selling to a first time sort of? A lot of times I see at least these buyers are kind of running a business for the first time themselves. They may have been involved in the industry or involved in, high up in a corporation where they weren't kind of the owner, and now they're buying a business. What, what are the risks for selling to somebody like that?
Well, so an ETA risk and a search fund risk are going to be two different things. So ETAs, I mean, the biggest difference, ultimately both you can lump them together in the sense they're both coming in with the goal of operating your business. So you're looking for you to make a
Hmm.
full exit. The bigger difference, like you said, that is search funders are typically looking for something bigger, 20, 30, 50 million, whatever it is, because they have committed capital and money behind them. But the goal is they're still going to run it. So the ETA risk, because they're smaller, are typically SBA buyers. They probably have some capital themselves, as the SBA will require it anyway. How much can vary. Some people take packages with whoever they've worked with in the past, or maybe they had some, employee equity at a company that got acquired or whatever, and that's what they're planning to use. Um, for a large majority of it, but typically speaking, ETAs are SBA backed. So that in itself is your risk. You're going to be contingent upon them being able to successfully close and fund, if they do not have cash that they can bring to the table. So if they do have cash that you can bring to the table, now it's a matter of your risk is, are they going to be able to successfully operate it if especially if there's a seller's note portion or anything like that, to where you're going to continue to get paid. So let's say it's a $5 million deal and they're putting, whatever, 2 million bucks or in of their own cash and funding 2 million from the SBA and $1 million seller's note. Well, they owe you $1 million. Are they going to be able to pay you and the SBA back? Are they going to be able to successfully run your business? So that's the risk there. Search fund. So that would be the question to ask if somebody is an ETR, if you're on that smaller side, like how are they funding? What's their experience? If especially if there's going to be any of those components of seller's note or anything like that. Um, Search funders, your risk. I've seen a lot of search funds get weirdly picky. So in the sense of, they have committed capital, but again, the person running it isn't necessarily going to be somebody who's super well versed in your industry or your business. A lot of times these search funds invest in the person. They think he's a great leader. They want to get him a business to run, and they just want to, it's kind of their way of getting into a private equity type engagement without just giving money to a PE fund. And they can get a kind of a bigger piece of the pie when they go in with a company rather than, with a PE fund, it's a much smaller piece. So, so because of that, they'll go through a lot of LOIs and pass on a lot of them. And so you could be there's a lot of tire kickers, I guess you hear that term a lot. And people just kind of, you know, look you lose, that kind of thing, where people are just kind of looking and peeking and not really moving forward because everybody's looking for the perfect business to buy, and which, you know, you and everybody else, so it kind of really doesn't exist.
Hmm. Right, right. That makes sense. Great. One other one more question here, and we got a Q. We actually have a Q and A here. Let me ask this last question, then we'll get to the Q of A. So, how do you assess? How do sellers should they assess, or how do you assess when you're advising these sellers on certainty to close, and how important is that in signing an LOI? Obviously, I mean, I know it, it's important, obviously, because if somebody can't close in the first place, then it doesn't make any sense to spend all your time
Right.
on this. But what are you looking for there on
Yeah.
analyzing buyers on whether you think they can actually close the deal or not?
Yeah, I think so. It's understanding how they're funding the deal first. And that is across the board, regardless of who's what, whether if it's a strategic, are they self-funding with cash and then or are they going the debt route? PE, like, the generic PE model is leverage. You hear that, a lot, but do they have the cash to close and then they're just going to leverage after the fact, or do they need to leverage up in order to close? That matters again, kind of along the same lines. And then, kind of that's just across the board. Do they have the money to close, or do they need to acquire debt in order to do so? And if they do need to acquire debt, that doesn't mean it's a bad deal or it's a bad buyer, but it raises other questions. And it might be something that, you get those 4 or 5 LOIs in front of you, you know, not that dissimilar if you're selling your house, right? If somebody is an all cash offer, but maybe it's a little bit less, but this person contingent upon funding, that's something to consider. So, what strategics and versus PEs, and like they kind of look at different things for QBs and their diligence process. Again, because it depends on why they're buying it. So if a strategic is buying it for market growth, they're going to, of course, do their diligence, but the generic thing is it's not going to be as stringent as maybe a QV that a PE firm would order. So I mean, those are all things that to consider.
Hmm. Got it. That makes sense. All right. Well, we're running out of time here, but last question here we have the Q of A from Andrea Garnett. Thanks for submitting the question. It says, "What is your opinion on the SBA E-Tran changes to the true search fund model?" And I think, and this is maybe deep in the weeds here for lenders, but the E-Tran piece, I assume that's where you're entering in the applicants, and their direct and indirect owners now, including the entity and individual owners is in. So I don't know. Did you have an opinion on that, John, or is that something that's maybe not sort of something you're dealing with all the time?
I haven't come across anything post those changes, because currently the things that I'm doing on the market are not SBA deals, or they're kind of more that middle market space. So I haven't run into anything since those changes have happened. Um, so, so sorry, the E-Tran what is the E-Tran then, who you were just saying?
Yeah, I think that's where they're entering in, and please add some color here if you want, Andrea. Where you're entering in sort of the application, you've got to put in the direct and indirect owners now. And I think the issue is with, you know, a lot of times you have search funds are set up in a way where they just say, oh, everybody's under 20% structure, so they don't have to, investors are all under 20%, so they don't have to be on the guarantee.
Oh,
But they're actually looking to control. That can be hidden, I think, through, entities and other things that where somebody may actually have it. But also the entity documents may have, you know, technical control. Like a lot of times there's, approval rights or redemption rights or things like that. And I think that's my understanding, at least. I think it is pretty early on this, but my take would be that it's traditional search fund documents have to be really looked at if they're looking at um, SBA deals. So here
right.
she add some color here with search funds. Now, if there has been a default, they are not eligible. How's that going to change buyer landscape for ETA deals? Search funds. Now, if there has been a default, they are not eligible. Hmm.
So, so
She just said no worries. This one we might have to take offline here,
yeah,
Andrea.
right,
I don't know,
right,
but
right.
say what you're going to say, John.
No, I was going to say it sounded like as you were kind of explaining it that it was almost like one of those. it's kind of like as a way to avoid that those people doing that circumvention, right? Where they form an entity that owns 5% and then they form another one 7% and so on and so on, but they actually have,
Hmm.
they would normally have to be on that guarantee. I don't, I mean, that will certainly dissuade some buyers, but I don't think, I don't, most search funders, to me, the search fund, is really about people who have committed capital via equity or they're getting their debt from one place and it's usually bigger than an SBA size. So I don't see it, I think to me, as it's explained to me, it's more about it really is about just limiting the people who are trying to kind of play in that gray area or doing kind of more a little bit of the shadier stuff, almost like kind of like the anti money laundering type thing of like, hey, we don't want people to know that we're doing this because we don't want to guarantee it or whatever. So I don't, on an ETA side, I mean, usually it's just one buyer anyway. So um, on the search fund side, most search funders that I've encountered in my experience on the who are buying, if they're buying or engaging with my clients, it's their the capital that they already have committed is mostly equity, and if they do have debt, it's usually actually more private debt and less traditional because it's just debt coming from one source and it hasn't been SBA debt.
Yeah. Yeah. I think
That's
lots of
part of
search
that
fund.
verification of funds, like we were kind of talking about, like where are you getting your money from?
Yeah, is it lots of search fund with ETA buyers in the SBA space. That's okay though, different world when we're talking about today. It's just yeah. So I think I guess for what it's worth, my thought is that the SBA rules now are kind of moving this SBA loans to more classic sort of owner operator buyers, and they're pushing it more towards that, it seems to me. And so the search funds that look more like PE funds with a CEO that they're putting in place, that is going to be harder, I think, to get an SBA deal done, is my sense. And so, anyway, we'll leave it at that. We're kind of running out of time here, so we will leave it there. But we can definitely have some more conversations on that. I think that is an interesting topic for us to address. I think so. But anyway, the let's we'll wrap it up. John, thank you so much for
Yeah,
taking the
thank you.
time to talk with us today. We really
Yeah.
appreciate it. Thank you for all the questions. And yeah, please reach out. Well, this webinar is recorded, so we'll be posting that, and all the contact information for John will be on there. So if you want to reach out to him directly, please do. And yeah, thanks everybody for joining.
All right. Thank you.
See ya.
Yeah.
Bye.